It was a warm, sunny day in the park. The world seemed to be at peace as Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly black woman, sat on a bench. Her gray hair swayed gently in the breeze, and a soft smile graced her face as she watched children playing nearby. Life at last appeared to be giving her the peace she had long yearned for. But peace has a way of being fleeting. From a distance, a man in uniform strode toward her. His expression was cold, tense, a white police officer, moving with purpose. His footsteps echoed sharply on the path, each one growing louder. People began to notice. Some exchanged glances, sensing the storm that was about to break. Mrs. Jenkins looked up as he approached, unafraid, yet something in his eyes sent a shiver through her. She hadn't expected trouble. Why should she? She'd lived in this town her entire life, knew its every corner, and all its people. But this officer wasn't here to talk. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his shadow casting a menacing silhouette over her frail figure. "Just resting, officer," Mrs. Jenkins replied, her voice calm but trembling ever so slightly. "You can't just sit around in this park," he snapped, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "There have to be rules for people like you. People like you." The words hit harder than any blow could. Her hands began to shake, memories of a past she'd tried to bury rushing back. Decades ago, people like you meant she didn't belong. It meant she wasn't allowed to be equal, that her place was always on the sidelines. "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer," she said, trying to remain composed. Her composure only enraged him further. He took a step closer, leaned down, and hissed in her face, "Didn't you hear me? I told you to get out of here now." But Mrs. Jenkins didn't move. She had lived too long, seen too much pain and injustice to cower now. She held his gaze, her eyes dignified and unyielding, while his twisted with anger. And then, without warning, he snapped. His hand shot out, gripping her arm with brutal force. She gasped in pain, trying to pull away, but his grasp was unrelenting. Then, faster than anyone could react, his fist crashed into her face. A loud crack echoed through the park, followed by a collective gasp from onlookers. Mrs. Jenkins crumpled to the ground, her face bleeding, her body trembling with shock and fear. The crowd began to stir. Some pulled out their phones, recording the horror unfolding before them. Others shouted in disbelief, "What are you doing?" But the officer, consumed by a hatred he had nursed for years, was oblivious. He stood over her, his eyes burning with the rage he'd harbored for those he considered less than. And just as he was about to strike again, a voice cut through the air, deep and furious. "Get your hands off my mother." The officer froze, his fist still raised, but he didn't turn around. Mrs. Jenkins lay helpless on the ground, her face swollen and bloodied, struggling to breathe. The voice, louder this time, came again. "I said, get your hands off my mother." Slowly, the officer turned. Standing before him was a tall black man, his presence commanding, his frame solid as stone. It was her son, James Jenkins, and his eyes burned with a fierce rage that seemed to chill the air around them. James stepped forward, his fists clenched, his gaze locked on the officer. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, stood still, phones at the ready. Some whispered in fear. Others simply watched in silence, aware that this moment was about something far bigger than the fate of one person. The officer, feeling threatened, hesitated for a split second. But pride and anger overtook him. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not to someone like James. "Is that your mother?" The officer sneered, still holding on to the arrogance of his authority. "Guess you're just like her. Breaking the rules, huh?" James didn't flinch. His face remained stone-like, but the fury in his eyes only grew more intense. This was a man who had seen too much, who had endured too much, and who was no longer willing to tolerate it. "I won't tell you again," James said, his voice low, controlled, and lethal. "You hit her. You're going to pay for it." The policeman took a step forward, his hand resting on his pistol holster. Fear rippled through the crowd, more palpable now than ever. Whispers broke out among the onlookers, some of them frozen in place, terrified that at any moment a shot might ring out. Hatred burned in the officer's eyes. This wasn't just about James. It was about everything he stood for. This was a clash, not merely with a person, but with the officer's twisted view of a world divided by oppression. Slowly, the officer drew his gun, aiming it directly at James. The crowd gasped in unison, some letting out screams of terror. "Come on," the policeman hissed, his hand trembling with tension. "You got something to say? Say it now. Let's see what you do when I shoot you right here." James stood unmoved, his eyes locked on the officers, though inside, turmoil raged. He wasn't just facing a man. He was staring down every hardship, every injustice his family had suffered over the years. The tension was thick, like the air before a storm, charged and suffocating. Mrs. Jenkins, still struggling to lift herself from the ground, her voice hoarse and pained, croaked out, "James, no need." But James couldn't turn back now. Not with the embodiment of all the hatred and violence his family had endured standing before him. The officer stood with his gun trained on James, finger tightening on the trigger, ready to end it all. The crowd remained paralyzed with fear, every person afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile silence. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Jenkins, propped up on her elbows, looked through blurred vision at her son. Her heart ached, not just from the pain of her injuries, but from the weight of a lifetime of fear and humiliation at the hands of people like this officer. She had seen too much, lived through too much. Fear of white officers who acted without consequence. And now, her son stood in the line of fire, unyielding, defiant. "You know how this ends, right?" The officer sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "One move, and you're gone." He stepped closer, the gun still trained on James's chest, the barrel inches away. The air was thick with an almost unbearable tension, but James didn't flinch. He didn't blink. Deep down, he knew the officer was on the verge of pulling the trigger. But it wasn't death that scared him. It was the sight of his mother suffering in front of him. "What do you mean by this?" James asked, his voice steady, quiet but firm. His calmness seemed to throw the officer off just for a moment, but the hesitation was fleeting. Mrs. Jenkins tried to speak again, but her voice was too weak. She saw her son not just as he was, but as the culmination of generations of pain and injustice. Her father had suffered the same brutality. Her brother had been beaten and arrested for defending himself. Now her son stood before that same hatred, facing the same cruel fate. Her heart broke. "James, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the tears streaming down her face. The policeman, noticing her vulnerability, sneered. Her fear only stoked the fire in his eyes. He turned to her, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "That's the problem." He spat like venom, his voice low and menacing. "She didn't teach you where your place is." With that, he swung his fist, striking Mrs. Jenkins again as she lay helpless on the ground. The sickening sound of the impact echoed through the park, and the crowd gasped in horror. Mrs. Jenkins collapsed, curling up like a fragile leaf battered by the wind. Her breathing labored, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. In that instant, all the fear James had felt transformed into something else. This wasn't just anger. It was a deep, burning hatred, born from centuries of helplessness in the face of injustice. His fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "That's enough," James growled through gritted teeth, his voice seething with controlled rage. "You'll pay for this." The officer turned back to him, grinning, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. He liked this, liked breaking people, liked exerting his power over them. He had no idea that he had just crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "Me? Pay for this?" The officer chuckled, his gun still aimed at James's heart. "Who's going to stop me, you?" James knew this moment could be his last, but he didn't care. His mother lay beaten at his feet. His anger was no longer his own. It was the weight of generations, the rage of those who had been broken, the fury of those who had suffered and could take no more. The officer stepped closer, his fingers slowly tightening on the trigger. The world seemed to slow, every breath loud, every movement deliberate. Fear and terror gripped the crowd as they watched, helpless. Then a click echoed through the park, but no shot followed. The officer's face flickered with confusion as he realized the gun had misfired. His finger twitched on the trigger, but nothing happened. For a moment, his vulnerability was exposed, and a cold sweat broke across his brow. But he quickly regained his composure, gritting his teeth, his rage boiling over, clouding his mind. "You're so damn lucky," the policeman hissed, swinging his leg at Mrs. Jenkins, who lay motionless on the ground. Her exhausted body was too weak to defend itself, curling instinctively into a ball, bracing for the next blow. But that blow never came. With a speed that took everyone by surprise, James lunged at the officer, his body moving like lightning. In a heartbeat, he grabbed the officer's arm mid-swing and squeezed so hard that the sickening crunch of bones echoed in the air. The policeman screamed in shock, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and fear as he realized the situation had slipped from his control. "Enough!" James didn't shout, but the fury in his voice was so fierce it could have scorched the earth around them. "You won't touch her again." The policeman struggled, trying to pull free, but James's grip was unbreakable. Panic gripped the man who had felt all-powerful just moments ago, certain he could crush lives without consequence. Now, he was the one trapped, fear tightening around his throat like a noose. In desperation, he reached for the baton on his belt, but James, still holding his hand, delivered a crushing blow to the officer's stomach. The breath exploded from his chest as he doubled over, his gun falling to the ground with a dull, final thud. "What does it feel like?" James's voice was low and trembling with barely contained fury. "What does it feel like to be helpless?" The policeman didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too stunned to comprehend what was happening. He, who had always wielded fear like a weapon, now stood at the precipice staring into the abyss. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing every second, every flicker of emotion. They were terrified for James and his mother, but also horrified by the raw violence unfolding before their eyes. James let go, and the officer crumpled to the ground, clutching his side, gasping for air. His face flushed with humiliation and anger, he tried to rise. He couldn't allow himself, a figure of authority, to be humiliated like this in front of a crowd. His voice, strained and ragged, barely croaked out, You'll regret this." But it no longer held the same venom. His power had slipped and he knew it. Yet even that wasn't enough to stop him. Stumbling, he reached for his baton again, determined to regain control. His last grasp at power. But James moved faster, knocking him off his feet and pinning him to the ground. His knee pressed hard into the officer's chest, and the cop wheezed, gasping for air. His eyes, wide with panic, told a new story. This wasn't just about pride anymore. He was terrified for his life. "You've spent your whole life thinking you could do whatever you wanted to people like my mother," James said through gritted teeth, his face inches from the cops. "You thought you were untouchable." The officer tried to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped his lips. James shoved him away, sending him sprawling back to the ground like a rag doll. The policeman lay there, wheezing, his face twisted with pain and fear. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what to make of this violent shift in power. James stood, his attention shifting to his mother. She lay on the ground, battered, her face marked by the officer's blows, but her eyes still gleamed with a quiet dignity. Even after all she'd endured, her spirit had not broken. The cop, however, wasn't done. Wheezing but determined, his face twisted with rage, he grabbed for his baton again. The last remnants of his humanity had drained away, leaving only a primal fury burning in his eyes. With a wild scream, he lunged at James, swinging the baton in a blind rage. "You will know your place," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. James barely dodged the first swing, the baton glancing off his shoulder with a sharp crack. Pain seared through his arm, but it was nothing compared to the fury boiling inside him. He understood now. This man was beyond reason, beyond control. His hatred had consumed him, leaving nothing but the urge to destroy. "You still think you can kill her?" James growled, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. "You think you can kill us all?" The crowd grew restless. People screamed, some begging for it to end. Others called the police while some tried to intervene, but fear kept them frozen in place. They knew this was no ordinary fight. This was a reckoning, years, decades of pain and oppression crashing together. And it could end in bloodshed. The officer swung again, but James caught his hand in an iron grip, twisting it until the crunch of bones reverberated through the park. The officer screamed, his face contorted with agony, but still he wouldn't stop. The baton clattered to the ground, but he launched himself at James, trying to tackle him to the ground. In that moment, James felt a spike of fear. This man was crazed, relentless. He wouldn't stop until he destroyed everything in his path. James realized that this might be the last moment of his life. "You're not a man," the officer spat, his face inches from James's. "You're nothing." Then, with a final burst of rage, he punched James in the face. James staggered, but didn't fall. The crowd gasped as the fight grew more savage by the second. But James didn't let the officer regain the upper hand. His fist connected with the cop's face, sending him sprawling backward, collapsing to his knees. Even then, the officer didn't relent. His eyes locked onto the gun that lay nearby. Trembling, he reached for it, his hands shaking with fury and desperation. He couldn't allow himself to be humiliated in front of this crowd. Not like this. "Die," he whispered, pointing the gun at James, the rage and hatred blazing in his eyes. Mrs. Jenkins, lying on the ground, saw it. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. Terror consumed her. All she could do was pray that somehow her son would survive. The park fell silent. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. The policeman rose to his feet once again, his face twisted with pure hatred. His eyes blazed, not just with rage, but with the ruthless confidence of a man who believed he could do anything he pleased. He didn't see Mrs. Jenkins as a person, just an object, a thing, something to be crushed under the weight of his contempt. She was nothing to him, just another problem to obliterate. His gaze swept across the crowd, their presence feeding his fury, their fear only fueling his thirst for dominance. Without warning, he swung his baton at Mrs. Jenkins' face. The blow was devastating, sending her crashing back to the ground. Her face contorted in pain, blood trickling from her split lip. For a brief moment, it seemed as if consciousness had slipped from her grasp. The crowd gasped in horror, some clapping hands over their mouths to stifle screams. "You think you're special?" the policeman growled, leaning over her battered body, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think your life means anything?" A weak moan escaped Mrs. Jenkins as she struggled to sit up, but her body betrayed her. Fear paralyzed her, and she had neither the strength nor the will to defend herself. She was utterly helpless before the man who saw her only as a symbol of everything he had hated all his life. "Get up," he barked, grabbing her by the shoulder and yanking her to her feet with brutal force. Her legs gave out almost instantly, and she collapsed back to the ground, defeated. "You're nothing," he spat, his voice venomous as he struck her again, this time in the ribs. Mrs. Jenkins coughed violently, gasping for air. The pain was blinding, shooting through her body like a firestorm. She could feel her ribs cracking beneath the blow, each breath a torturous effort. But even that wasn't enough for him. The racism that had festered within him for years, decades of hatred, poured out with every savage strike. It wasn't just violence anymore. It was a spectacle, a display of power meant to degrade and dehumanize not only this woman, but an entire race. He knew what he was doing, and the worst part was, He loved it. "Look at her," he roared, turning to the crowd, his face flushed with excitement, as if his cruelty had reached some perverse crescendo. "This is what you get. You're all like this. You think you deserve respect? You deserve nothing. You obey." The sheer venom in his voice sent a wave of horror through the crowd. Some began to retreat, unable to bear the sight, but no one could tear their eyes away. What was happening wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was something deeper, something ancient and vile. It was the embodiment of centuries of fear, oppression, and hate, playing out before them. He raised the baton again, preparing to strike. But before he could bring it down, James, her son, burst into the circle like a force of nature. His heart pounded with terror, the fear for his mother's life blinding him to everything else. With a fury born of desperation, he launched himself at the officer, his fists slamming into the man's body with such force that the policeman staggered back, off balance. But the cop was undeterred. His sneer returned, blood trickling from his lip as he wiped it away with the back of his hand. "There you are," he said coldly, raising his baton once more. "You think I can't handle you too?" The situation became even more perilous. The crowd watched as James, driven by rage and despair, charged the officer, desperate to protect his mother. But the cop was ready. He swung his baton with brutal precision, catching James in the chest and sending him flying backward, crashing to the ground beside his mother. "You thought you were strong," the policeman hissed, towering over James, raising his baton for another strike. "You're just trash, just like her." The dull sound of the baton connecting with James's body was sickening. James tried to stand, but each time he was knocked back down, the officer's blows relentless. It seemed as though the cop's cruelty knew no bounds. He didn't just want to leave physical scars, he wanted to leave a mark on their souls, to show them that their place was beneath his feet. Mrs. Jenkins, watching her son being beaten, gathered what little strength she had left, reaching out for him, but her body refused to obey. Every second felt like an eternity, each moment dragging them closer to what felt like an inevitable end. Fear for her son's life burned through her, but she was powerless, trapped in her own broken body. The policeman, breathing heavily but driven by a growing rage, seemed to feed on his own hatred. In his fevered mind, Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just an elderly black woman. She was the embodiment of everything he despised, everything he believed threatened his power, his peace, his very rights. His racism had become the fuel for his violence, propelling him to greater and greater acts of brutality. He stepped toward Mrs. Jenkins again, her body unable to withstand the relentless assault. Her face was swollen and bruised, her lips split, her eyes nearly swollen shut. But the cop didn't see her as a victim. In his eyes, she was still an enemy, someone who needed to be crushed. "You think you deserve pity?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You think any of you deserve anything more than this?" With a savage grunt, he brought the baton down hard across her stomach. The air rushed from Mrs. Jenkins' lungs as her body convulsed in agony, her eyes wide with pain. She could barely move, every breath sending waves of searing pain through her shattered ribs. Blood poured from her mouth, but she couldn't make a sound. Her eyes, filled with horror and fear, stared blankly at the sky, which seemed to have turned its back on her. The policeman struck her again, this time across her back. Mrs. Jenkins arched in pain, but no scream came. Her breathing was short, ragged gasps as if her lungs no longer had the strength to take in air. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the blood. She felt her life slipping away with every blow, her strength fading as her body gave out. The crowd stood frozen, watching this horrific display, a collective paralysis gripping them. No one dared intervene. The fear was too great, the violence too overwhelming. Some in the crowd began to cry, their hearts pounding wildly. But they all knew, if anyone tried to step in, they would become the next victim. The policeman was like a beast that had lost all sense of control, his brutality reaching a fever pitch. Mrs. Jenkins tried to speak, to call out to her son, But instead of words, only a hoarse sound escaped her throat. She wanted to see him, to feel his presence in what she knew might be her final moments. But her voice was too weak, her body too broken. Her hands shook uncontrollably and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Death felt close now, creeping up with a cold certainty. The policeman leaned over her, his face a mask of cruelty. He grabbed her hair with a savage grip, yanking her head up, forcing her to look into his eyes. "That's it," he sneered through clenched teeth, his breath hot and filled with venom. "This is how you all should be. Under my feet." He pulled her hair so hard that her scalp burned with pain, but Mrs. Jenkins could no longer resist. Her body had given up. The coldness in her limbs reached toward her heart, and her breathing grew quieter, slower. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, and she teetered on the brink between life and death. With a cruel final kick, the policeman sent her body rolling lifelessly on the ground. Her fingers twitched, blood dripping steadily from her cracked lips. The crowd, gripped by shock, couldn't bear to watch, yet none of them moved. They were frozen, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what was unfolding before their eyes. Suddenly, through the haze of pain, Mrs. Jenkins felt the presence of someone nearby. Her swollen eyes struggled to focus, barely making out the figure of James, her son. He was charging toward the policeman, his heart pounding in his chest, each beat more desperate than the last. James's mind was racing. He wasn't just watching the cop destroy his mother. With every blow, the officer was trying to obliterate everything she stood for: her strength, her resilience, her love. A surge of rage filled James, threatening to explode. He screamed, throwing himself at the officer, his body moving with a frantic energy to save his mother. "Leave her alone," he growled, his voice trembling with fury. He lunged at the cop, grabbing his shoulder, but the officer, with eyes blazing like those of a wild animal, spun around, shoving James back with shocking force. "Get out, brat," he snarled. James stumbled but didn't fall. He wasn't about to let this monster kill his mother. Wiping blood from his lip, the policeman raised his baton again, hatred burning in his eyes. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, lifting the club higher. "I'll do the same to you as I did to her." He rushed toward James, but this time James managed to dodge, the baton whistling past him and slamming into the ground. The dull thud echoed in James's ears, but he knew time was running out. His mother's life was hanging by a thread and every second counted. With all the strength he could muster, James lunged forward again, catching the cop by the wrist, preventing him from raising the baton for another strike. The policeman's hatred was palpable, radiating off him like a toxic cloud. But James refused to let go. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a battle for his mother's life, for their dignity, for a future free from the terror that men like this policeman represented. "You can't do this," James shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He tried to shake the officer, as if hoping to break through to him, to make him understand the horror of what he was doing. But the policeman was beyond reason. With an animalistic roar of rage, he broke free from James's grip, swinging the baton with brutal force. James barely managed to retreat, but the next blow caught him on the shoulder, pain ripping through his body. He screamed in agony, but something inside him refused to let go. He rose again, defying the searing pain, his heart blazing with determination. "I won't let you kill her," James screamed, his voice hoarse with emotion. Despite the growing terror in his chest, James knew he had no choice. This fight wouldn't end with a compromise. Either they both survived or one of them would die. His muscles ached, his energy waning, but he charged forward once more, desperation fueling him. As if in response to his courage, a loud siren suddenly pierced the air. Salvation. The crowd began to stir, their collective breath held, as the unmistakable sound of law enforcement drew nearer. But the policeman, like a man possessed, paid no mind to the approaching sirens. He raised his baton again, his body trembling with fury. Even as the crowd's screams grew louder, he seemed intent on finishing what he started. James knew they had only moments left. "Mom, hold on!" he screamed, trying desperately to distract the officer. But instead, the policeman charged at him, his eyes wild with hatred. James's heart pounded in his chest, fear constricting his throat as the cop lunged for him once more. But then, through the haze of violence, James saw movement. People were approaching, drawn by the sounds of the fight. They were running toward him, their faces twisted in horror as they realized what was happening. For the first time, hope flickered in James's heart. Perhaps they could help. Perhaps together they could stop this madness. The policeman, however, saw the approaching crowd and snarled in fury. His lip curled in disgust as he barked at them. "Get out! This is none of your business!" His voice was filled with venom. "You're all the same. I'll kill every one of you if you don't leave." But now the tide was turning. The people drew closer and the cop's frantic words fell on deaf ears. This was no longer just about Mrs. Jenkins or James. This was about something bigger, something that couldn't be crushed by one man's hatred. James realized they had to act now. There was no more time to waste. His mother lay vulnerable, not just beneath the brutality of the policeman, but under the crushing weight of a system that sought to destroy anything in its path for the sake of power and control. Standing at the edge of a chasm of fear and rage, adrenaline surged through James's veins. He knew it was all up to him. Every second they lost brought his mother closer to the brink of death. The cop, eyes narrowed and lips curled with malevolent intent, prepared to strike again. But before the baton could fall, James stepped forward, his voice ringing with determination. "Don't you dare touch her," he shouted, rushing toward the officer, desperate to draw his attention away from Mrs. Jenkins. With a feral growl, the policeman rebuffed James's attempt with unexpected ferocity. His fist shot out, landing squarely in James's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. James's breath escaped him in a sharp gasp, his lungs burning from the blow, but he refused to stay down. He staggered to his feet, pain coursing through him, his vision blurring. Through the haze, he saw his mother lying motionless. Her face was twisted in agony, but there was also something else in her eyes, something that made James's heart tighten with emotion. Amid the fear, there was love. Boundless, enduring love. Her quiet, pained voice broke through his haze. "James, I'm okay," she whispered, though her body betrayed her words. That moment hit him like a lightning bolt. Her courage, even as she lay broken, was a light in the suffocating darkness. He couldn't leave her. "Mom, I won't leave you," James screamed, his voice cracking. With renewed resolve, he charged at the policeman again, his fists clenched with all the rage and fear he'd been holding in. The policeman, now sensing a threat, became more vicious. He swung his baton violently, and this time the blow landed squarely on James's shoulder, knocking him to the ground once more. Pain radiated through James's body, as though hot metal had pierced his flesh. But in that very instant, something inside him ignited. A spark fueled by years of watching his mother fight against injustice, against prejudice. Her strength became his. "You can't break me," James growled through gritted teeth, forcing himself back to his feet. His adversary's surprise only spurred him on. James stood tall, his muscles straining with determination. The policeman, like a cornered animal, swung his baton again, but before it could connect, the air was pierced by the sound of blaring sirens. The sharp, jarring wail sent a wave of tension through the crowd, who had been paralyzed in horror until now. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. "Get away from her!" someone shouted, pushing forward. The spell of fear that had gripped the onlookers began to break. Slowly, like an awakening, the crowd began to stir. People, realizing that their silence could no longer be justified, started to move forward, their outrage palpable. The policeman, sensing the tide turning, panicked. He tried to retreat, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. But the anger of the crowd was building. No longer could they stand by and watch a defenseless woman be brutalized in front of them. It was like watching a dam break, the collective fury, the realization that any one of them could be in Mrs. Jenkins's place, gave them the courage to act. James seized the moment. With the officer distracted, he rushed toward his mother. He knelt beside her, gently cradling her in his arms. "Mom, I'm here. "I'm with you," he whispered, his heart pounding wildly in his chest as her ragged breaths grew weaker. His vision blurred, not from pain, but from the overwhelming fear of losing her. The policeman, his desperation growing with every passing second, swung his baton wildly once more. "Get your hands off her!" someone in the crowd shouted, lunging toward the officer, pulling him back. Hands reached out from all sides, restraining the policeman as the once passive onlookers became a united front. The officer, his eyes flashing with hatred, spat vicious threats, his voice rising to a fevered pitch. "You're all under arrest," he roared, though his words were now tinged with fear as he realized his power was crumbling. But no one was willing to back down. The crowd, driven by a shared sense of justice, was no longer willing to let this man's cruelty go unanswered. James, still clutching his mother's frail body, looked up. The faces surrounding him were filled with determination, anger, and a fierce desire to protect. He realized in that moment that they were not alone anymore. Hope swelled in his chest. This wasn't just his fight or his mother's, it was theirs. It was everyone's. The policeman, surrounded and outnumbered, swung his baton again, still trying to assert his fading dominance. "Don't interfere," he barked, though his words fell hollow now. "You'll end up just like her." He lunged toward Mrs. Jenkins once more, but the crowd surged forward, hands gripping his arms, pulling him back. "This is wrong," someone yelled, and that single cry resonated with everyone present. The officer, now trapped, flailed like a rabid animal, swinging wildly at anyone who dared to get too close. Each blow he landed only fueled the crowd's resolve. James, tears streaming down his face, clung to his mother as the violence raged around him. Every swing, every cry, every blow felt like another wound, not just to Mrs. Jenkins, but to everyone witnessing the horror. "Please, stop," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice so faint it was barely audible, her tears mixed with blood trickling down her cheeks. She knew her strength was fading, and her greatest fear wasn't for herself. It was for James. She didn't want him to become another victim of the hatred that had marked her life. But the policeman's rage was insatiable. His baton fell again and again, each strike more savage than the last, until the pavement was stained with blood. "You think you're important?" he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "You're nothing. None of you mean anything." On the edge of madness, James felt the world around him narrow to a single point. His mother, broken and bloody, her life slipping away. The policeman, snarling and vicious, his hatred unrelenting. And the crowd, finally courageously rising to stop this cruelty once and for all. With a deep breath, James prepared for one final desperate step. His thoughts blurred into a swirl of anger, helplessness, and a fierce, protective love. He knew that if he did nothing, his mother would die, and he could not let that happen. "I won't let you take her," James screamed, rushing toward the policeman again. In that instant, he realized that he had become the target. It was like a knife through his heart, but he couldn't give up now. The cop's eyes blazed with hatred as he turned, hurling his baton at James. With an adrenaline-fueled burst, James dodged the strike and lunged forward, this time managing to grab hold of the officer's shoulder, pulling him back with all his might. But the policeman whipped around like a feral beast, and James felt his strength begin to fade. He knew this fight couldn't be won alone. As he turned to glance at his mother, his heart sank in horror. She lay motionless, her body battered, her lips bloodied. "No, Mom," he cried, his voice breaking with pain, hopelessness, and fear. He couldn't let this be the end. The crowd, witnessing the brutal escalation, began to act. They surged forward, their collective anger building, shouting for justice. "This is not okay," someone yelled. "We're here to stop this." But the policeman only smirked, sensing his power slip. He took a step back, his face twisted with hatred, feeding on his fear of losing control. "You'll all answer for this," the officer roared, his voice teetering on the edge of madness. But James saw the opportunity. The cop was losing his grip. Despite the pain in his body, James rose to his feet, his resolve unshaken. The crowd closed in, attempting to free Mrs. Jenkins from the officer's grasp. Suddenly, the policeman, desperate to assert his dominance, pulled out his gun. The air froze. Every person in the crowd stopped, realizing the gravity of the moment. "Get out or I'll shoot you all," the officer bellowed, his voice trembling. His hand shook on the trigger, his eyes wild with fear and fury. It was the most terrifying moment of all, one where everything could end in a heartbeat. James felt panic rise like a wave, crashing over him. Not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him hung in the balance. His mother, her eyes barely open, glanced at him through a haze of pain, silently pleading for him to survive this nightmare. James clenched his fists, steeling himself for what was to come. "We won't let you do this," he shouted, his voice resolute, cutting through the thick tension in the air. But the policeman only grinned, his fingers twitching on the trigger. There was nothing human left in his eyes, just pure, unfiltered hatred. "This is your mistake," the officer whispered coldly. Time seemed to stop. The crowd began to shift, but fear paralyzed them, each movement slow and fraught with anxiety. James's heart pounded in his chest, every beat loud and heavy, as if the world had shrunk to this single horrifying moment. He glanced at his mother again, her body broken, her face mangled, and his determination only deepened. "Mom, I'm with you," he whispered, preparing for the final desperate act. As the crowd began to stir, their voices grew louder, more unified, demanding justice and protection. Their fear gave way to anger, and that anger turned into action. "We're not afraid of you," someone shouted, and that cry became the signal. The crowd moved forward, driven by their shared outrage. The officer, sensing the tides turning completely against him, started to tremble. His eyes darted between James and the encroaching crowd, panic flashing in his gaze. He knew the situation could spiral into a full-blown uprising, and the thought terrified him. "Get your hands off me or I'll shoot," he screamed again, but the confidence in his voice was gone. The crowd wasn't backing down. They were done tolerating his cruelty. James, unaware of his own fear, stood tall. He knew this was the moment that would decide everything. "I won't let you kill her," he shouted, his voice shaking the air as he broke through the crowd. His eyes locked on the policeman, his hands raised in a final plea. "Listen to me," he called out, his voice firm and unwavering. "This isn't just my mother. This is a woman who deserves to live. We're all here for justice." The crowd responded to James's call, their voices joining his. Some moved forward, forming a human barrier around Mrs. Jenkins, their fists clenched, eyes burning with determination. The officer, now visibly losing his nerve, raised his gun again, his finger hovering over the trigger. James watched, his breath catching in his throat as the policeman's hand twitched. The seconds stretched into eternity, each one heavier than the last. Every breath felt like it could be his final one. Every movement seemed unbearably slow. Then, from the crowd, someone shouted, "Behind you!" The officer spun around, but his actions only intensified the crowd's resolve. They were no longer afraid. They were ready to stop him. A sharp sound pierced the air. A bottle, thrown from somewhere in the crowd, shattered near the officer's feet. It was like a spark in a powder keg. The atmosphere exploded into chaos. The policeman, visibly shaken, took a step back, his weapon trembling in his hand, as if the world around him had spiraled out of control. "Get him out!" someone from the crowd shouted. At that moment, James saw several people rushing toward the officer like a storm unleashed from their hearts. His body ached, but he lunged forward, grabbing the policeman's gun hand. It was a desperate move, and James felt the sharp sting of pain, but he refused to let go. "You won't get away with this," he growled, ignoring the throbbing in his body. The policeman, enraged, tried to free his hand, but James held firm. The world spun around them as the crowd surged with one unified purpose, drawing the officer's attention away from Mrs. Jenkins. Shouts for justice rang out, filling the air with a palpable sense of power and unity. James felt it too, the strength of standing together, but the cop was losing control. His rage erupted as he threw James aside and pointed his gun at the crowd. Time seemed to slow. The crowd rushed toward the officer, a fierce struggle for life and dignity unfolding before James's eyes. A gunshot echoed through the chaos, and for a brief moment, everything froze. Silence fell as if the world held its breath. James, struggling to rise from the ground, saw everything had changed. He looked to his mother, her eyes filled with both fear and determination, even through her pain. But she was unconscious now, her body battered. The policeman, still clutching his weapon, continued to threaten the crowd, but his fear was now visible, mixing with his rage. James's emotions swirled: fear, anger, helplessness. But deep down, a new determination took root. He couldn't let this despot destroy the only family he had left. Rising from the ground, his heart filled with hatred for what was happening, James took one step after another toward the policeman, fear fading and courage taking its place. "You have no right to treat her like that," he shouted, his voice strong and unwavering. He moved closer, positioning himself like a shield between the officer and his mother. The policeman turned, his eyes blazing with fury, gripping his baton so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Get out of my way, boy," he snarled, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know who you're dealing with." James swallowed, his heart pounding, but he didn't back down. "This is my mom," he said, his voice resolute. "She didn't do anything to deserve this. We were just sitting in the park enjoying the day." With every word, the tension thickened. The crowd, emboldened by James's courage, began to rise, their voices swelling together. "You have no right to be so cruel," a woman shouted, her voice filled with defiance. The officer, sensing his control slipping, took another wild swing at James, his eyes filled with madness. But James didn't retreat. He rushed forward, adrenaline pumping through his veins, and reached for the officer's hand gripping the gun. It happened in a blur. The cop spun around and James's hand touched the cold metal of the weapon. Before he could fully react, another scream rang out from the crowd, and several people hurled objects at the policeman, trying to distract him. "Don't touch him, you bastard," a man shouted, throwing a bottle. The policeman, momentarily disoriented, took a step back. James seized the moment, grabbing the officer by the shoulder. "I won't let you hurt her," he yelled, his voice filled with raw fury. The crowd, now fully united, formed a human shield around Mrs. Jenkins, their hands clasped tightly together, creating a protective barrier the policeman couldn't penetrate. It was a powerful display of unity and strength, something they had never experienced before. The officer, seeing he was surrounded, grew even more aggressive, raising his baton and threatening the crowd again, but their determination only hardened. "We will not retreat," a man shouted, raising his fist. The crowd's voices merged into a thunderous chorus of opposition, a wave of defiance crashing down on the officer. Fear washed over the policeman. His authority, once built on fear, was crumbling. James used this brief window to rush to his mother's side. Kneeling beside her, his heart ached at the sight of her bruised and battered face. Gently, he pulled her close, trying to give her his strength. "Mom, I'm with you," he whispered, holding her in his arms. Her breathing was shallow and it spurred him on, filling him with resolve. "James," she whispered weakly, her eyes fluttering open. Despite the pain, there was tenderness in her gaze. "Don't risk your life. I don't want you to get hurt." "I can't just watch," James replied, squeezing her hand. "I won't let him take you." He glanced up at the crowd, their voices rising even louder, their presence a wall of solidarity against the officer's brutality. The policeman's panic grew as the crowd advanced, his power eroding with every step they took. His only weapon was fear, and now that fear was slipping away. He realized the crowd was no longer afraid, and with that realization, his grip on power disintegrated. James finally gathered his strength. He knew the time had come to act decisively. As the crowd surged with determination, he rose to his feet once more, resolute in his mission to protect his mother. The policeman stood before him, a symbol of everything wrong in this moment of injustice. James locked eyes with him and shouted, "We won't let you leave with her." His voice rang out, a challenge that couldn't be ignored. The crowd around him echoed his cry, and James felt a wave of unity wash over them all. This was no longer just his fight. It was a battle for justice, for life, for freedom. The fear that once gripped them was fading as they realized they were not alone. James, full of strength, turned back to the policeman. The power of their unity could change everything. He stood his ground, determined to protect his mother and everyone beside him. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest as he glared at the man who had hurt his mother. A man who was supposed to protect, not oppress. Each second felt like an eternity. James could feel the weight of the moment, but the crowd's unwavering support gave him courage. He took a deep breath, his mind filled with one thought. He couldn't let this go on. His body surged with adrenaline as he stepped forward, his voice firm and loud. "You will get nothing from me," he shouted, making sure the officer and everyone else could hear him. "Don't touch her." The policeman, clearly taken aback by James's defiance, clutched his baton tighter, hesitating. He hadn't expected anyone to dare stand up to him, and that hesitation only fueled his anger. "You're too small to make a difference," he growled, trying to intimidate James. But James, feeling the crowd's support behind him like a rising tide, stood tall. "You can't intimidate us." His voice boomed, surprising even himself. He stepped closer, eyes burning with resolve. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted to us, but we won't stay silent anymore." A cheer rose from the crowd, inspired by James's courage. People, emboldened, began to rise, creating a united front against cruelty. The atmosphere crackled with energy as if everyone felt this was the moment of truth. The policeman, realizing his power was slipping, swung his baton, stepping toward James. But James's mind was made up. He couldn't let his mother suffer any longer. "No!" he screamed, charging forward. He dodged the baton at the last moment, grabbing the officer's arm. Pain shot through him, but he focused on the task at hand. With his heart racing, James yanked hard on the officer's wrist, trying to knock the baton loose. The policeman, not expecting such fierce resistance, staggered but fought back, attempting to throw James off. Yet James held on, his grip unyielding. "Get your hands off my mother," he screamed, his voice raw with fury. The crowd's cheers grew louder, their support giving James the strength he needed. People pressed forward, creating a barrier between the policeman and Mrs. Jenkins. It was like a real storm brewing, a force of justice that couldn't be ignored. "Take your hands off," the policeman barked, but his voice lacked its former menace. He knew this could lead to an uprising, and fear flickered in his eyes. He struggled to free his hand, but James wouldn't let go. Adrenaline surged through him as he tightened his grip, focused on one goal: to protect his mother and make the officer pay for what he had done. James, his gaze sharpened with determination, gathered all his strength and shoved the officer, throwing him off balance. "You can't break us," he shouted, his voice ringing with defiance. The crowd roared in approval, and the sight of their support bolstered his confidence even more. Together, they began to form a united wall, their hands raised in solidarity against the policeman. Realizing his control was slipping further, the officer swung his baton again, but the crowd rushed in, throwing objects, forcing him into a panicked retreat. Chaos erupted, and James could see fear etched on the officer's face. The momentum had shifted. This was their fight now. James lunged again, grabbing the policeman by the shoulder and pushing him back. It felt like two worlds colliding. On one side, his mother's fragile life, and on the other, the cruelty they could no longer tolerate. He knew this was the moment they could change everything. "You can't just walk away from this," James shouted, the crowd closing in, feeding him strength. The policeman, now isolated and realizing no backup was coming, made one last desperate attempt to strike James, but he dodged and tackled him again. Suddenly, the wail of sirens cut through the air. Police cars were speeding toward them, and the crowd's confidence wavered, fear creeping back in. James knew time was running out. They had to act fast. "We have to get her out of here," he shouted, pointing to his mother. "She needs help." Without hesitation, the crowd sprang into action, moving toward Mrs. Jenkins to lift her up and carry her away to safety. James, his heart pounding in sync with the crowd's rhythm, clasped his hands into tight fists. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about all of them. It was about their right to be heard, to demand justice. And in that moment, as the sirens grew louder and hope seemed to dim, he saw people from the crowd rushing toward him, ready to stand by his side. Together, they would fight. Together, they would win. It was a moment of true unity. Everyone understood they weren't alone. James, inspired by the energy around him, shouted, "Let's do this together." His voice ignited the crowd, who rose again, their cries swelling with renewed vigor. This wasn't just a protest. It was solidarity in action. In that instant, James realized they could make a difference if they acted as one. "We will fight for our truth," he roared, clenching his fists and thrusting them into the air. It was a moment of unbreakable strength, one no policeman could shatter. Fueled by determination, they moved as one to reclaim the justice that was being stolen from them. James felt the crowd's energy coursing through him, giving him strength. Every cry, every movement, every united breath melded into one powerful force, ready to stand against injustice. Grabbing his mother's arm, he helped her to her feet, feeling her grip tighten on his shoulder. There was fear in her eyes, but pride as well. Her son wasn't backing down. "We're leaving, Mom," he whispered, trying to reassure her as the crowd began to move towards the park's exit. The policeman, sensing their loss of control, panicked. A frantic officer barked orders into his radio, but James knew they had only minutes to escape. The crowd, united by purpose, closed ranks around him and his mother, forming a human barrier between them and the desperate police. A policeman, wild with frustration, swung his baton at a nearby protester. But in a flash, someone next to James shoved the officer aside, creating an opening. It was as if the crowd moved on instinct, coming together to resist violence. James's heart filled with hope and strength as the mass surged forward. "Stay together," someone shouted, and it became a rallying cry. Everyone understood. Now was the time to unite, to protect each other. James clutched his mother's hand tightly. Though she was weak, he drew strength from her, and they slowly made their way towards the exit. But the officer, his authority crumbling, bellowed at them to stop. "Stop!" he shrieked, his voice dripping with menace. But no one would submit to fear anymore. "We will not remain silent," came a defiant shout from the crowd, followed by others. Enough violence. Step by step, cry by cry, their determination grew. James felt his anger transform into resolve. He would not allow the policeman to lay a hand on his mother again. With eyes full of fire, James stepped forward as the crowd pressed on. Then, in a moment of slow-motion clarity, he saw another officer swing his baton at them. "Look out!" he yelled, and the crowd instinctively parted to avoid the blow. But in that split second, James saw his chance. He rushed forward, every ounce of his strength focused on knocking the baton from the officer's hands. "You can't intimidate us!" he shouted, charging forward. It was risky, but he knew he had to protect his mother and everyone else. Rage bubbled up inside him as he grabbed the baton. He wasn't going to let the officer get away with this. But just as he seized it, another cop lunged at him, trying to wrestle him down. This was the start of the real fight. Screams erupted as the police moved in, but James refused to back down. Every blow from the police felt like an attack on justice itself. He couldn't let them win. "We won't let you do this," he cried, turning to the crowd. "For me. For us." The crowd, united in spirit, surged forward again. They pushed towards the police, who began to retreat, overwhelmed by the strength of their resistance. James, adrenaline coursing through him, dropped the baton and raised his hands. "Together we are stronger," he yelled, his words echoing in the hearts of the people. The crowd responded, becoming an unstoppable force. The police, realizing they were losing control, looked around in confusion. But the crowd, now inspired by James, would not retreat. They pushed forward, creating an unbreakable line, forcing the police to fall back. "Get out of our way!" someone yelled, and the crowd pressed harder. James felt his confidence soar. Finally, they broke free. James turned to his mother, seeing the exhaustion on her face. It hit him like a punch to the chest. Their fight wasn't over, but at least they were free from the immediate threat. "We did it, Mom," he said, holding her close. Her breathing steadied, and he felt the relief in her embrace. They had survived, and now they had a chance to escape the violence. Around them, laughter and cheers filled the air as the crowd realized their victory. But inside James, a flame of rage and determination still burned. This was only the beginning. They would keep fighting, for their rights, for their families, and for everyone who had faced injustice. "We will fight on," he shouted, and once again the crowd roared in response. It was a promise. United, they had become stronger than ever, and now they would not stop until justice was won. James knew they had to unite if they were going to change the world. This fight wasn't just for his mother. It was for the future of everyone who had suffered under injustice. The battle had only begun. As they left the park, adrenaline still pumped through James's veins. He held his mother's hand, her face pale with fear and pain, yet her eyes still glowing with hope. They had escaped, but his heart burned with the desire for revenge. He couldn't just let this go. That night, staring at the ceiling, the image of the policeman raising his hand to his mother haunted him. It lingered in his mind, turning into a fierce desire for justice. He knew he couldn't do it alone, so he decided to rally his friends. The next day at school, he gathered his peers, telling them what had happened in the park. Every one of them felt the same rage and helplessness. This collective anger united them. "We need to show them we're not afraid," said Derek, one of his closest friends, his voice steady and full of resolve. James agreed. They decided to form a group to monitor police actions, documenting any injustice they witnessed. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about fighting for their rights and for everyone else who had been wronged. A few days later, they discovered that the same officer who had attacked James's mother was back, patrolling the same area. It was time to act. James and his friends began organizing a protest to draw attention to the violence inflicted on his mother. They made posters, prepared slogans, and spread the word. "This is our message," James told them, determination burning in his voice. "We have to show them we're not alone." As the sun began to set on the day of the protest, the crowd gathered. James stood at the front, his heart pounding with anticipation. People came, many of them carrying their own stories of injustice. James took a deep breath, then shouted into the microphone, "We're here to say, no more violence." His voice cut through the air, confident and clear. The crowd responded, their energy rising to match his. The protest began peacefully, but with each passing moment, the tension grew. Shoulder to shoulder, people stood firm, demanding justice and their right to be heard. James realized that this wasn't just about his mother. It was about all of them. They were fighting for everyone who had been wronged by those meant to protect them. As the protest reached its peak, James noticed police cars arriving. His heart quickened, and the fire inside him flared. He knew it could get dangerous, but he wasn't backing down. "We are not afraid of you," he shouted, his voice a challenge. The crowd echoed his defiance. The police stepped out of their cars, their faces stern, but James could sense their fear. They knew their authority was being challenged. James and his friends moved towards the police, driven by the same mix of fear and anger they had felt that night in the park. But this time they weren't alone. "We know what you did," James shouted, pointing at the officers, "and we won't let you do it again." The crowd roared in support, their unity giving them strength. James could see the police exchanging nervous glances. Fear was already creeping in. This was their moment, and they weren't going to waste it. The police, growing desperate, began to use force to disperse the crowd. But James, resolute, stepped forward. "We're not leaving," he shouted, his voice unwavering. He locked eyes with one of the officers and saw fear and confusion staring back at him. That was what he was looking for. Pulling himself together, James surged forward, grabbing the officer by the arm just like he had done before. His friends followed, forming a human circle around him, creating a barrier between the police and the protesters. It was like magic. The crowd felt invincible, as though together they could achieve anything. The crowd began to press forward, their voices rising as one. The police, realizing they were losing control, retreated. James, standing at the front, raised a sign that read, "We have a right to justice." This was his manifesto, his challenge. "We will not remain silent," he shouted, and at that moment the police pulled back. It was as if they suddenly realized they could no longer control the situation. James watched the fear spread across the officers' faces. They were only human, and they were afraid. This revelation filled James with a sense of power. "We will win," he declared, and the crowd cheered. At that moment, everyone believed they could change the world. This wasn't just revenge for his mother. It was a fight for justice for everyone. And James knew they could win. As the police continued to retreat, satisfaction welled up in James. Their unity had forced the aggressors to back down. This moment became a symbol of victory. But instead of celebrating, James felt a deeper resolve. The revenge he sought wasn't complete. The image of the officer who had attacked his mother still haunted him, and the thirst for justice burned brighter than ever. "This can't end here," James said, turning to his friends, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "We can't let this go." They all stood there, bound by a sense of unity, knowing that this fight had only just begun. "We have to make this policeman answer for his actions," James said, his friends' unwavering support fueling his confidence. They started brainstorming, and soon an idea took root, a plan to gather all the evidence they could and prepare a case against the officer. James knew that getting the attention of the local media and human rights activists would be key. In the days that followed, James and his friends worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, recording statements, and collecting videos taken during the protests. Each new piece of evidence strengthened their resolve. They exchanged messages late into the night, meticulously planning their next steps. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about justice. One evening, while hanging out with friends in the library, James received a text. It was a photo of the officer standing with other policemen on patrol. James's heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto the face of the man who had attacked his mother. Rage boiled inside him. "We have to do something," he said, his voice low and firm. "We can't let him keep serving." His friends agreed. They decided to organize an action bigger than just a protest. This time, they'd call the press and ensure that the whole country knew about the injustice in the park. The risk was great, but their anger and determination outweighed any fear. On the day of the protest, a crowd gathered outside the police station. James stood at the front holding a sign that read, "Justice for All." The fire in his eyes burned brighter than ever. He knew this was his moment. As the local media started to cover the event, James stepped forward and spoke into the microphone. He described the attack on his mother, the toll it had taken on his family, and the drive to prevent such acts from happening again. "We are here to show that we will not stay silent," he shouted, his voice ringing with conviction. The crowd roared in support, strengthening him. But as he spoke, he noticed several police officers approaching, their faces stern and displeased. Among them was the same officer, the one who had attacked his mother. "You don't belong here," the officer shouted, his voice thick with threat. But instead of fear, James felt only determination. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the policeman. "You will answer for your actions," he said, his words cutting through the air. The crowd cheered in solidarity. The officer, sensing the crowd's growing defiance, started to falter. James could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He pressed on, pouring out all the pain and injustice they had experienced, speaking not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged. The local media cameras recorded every moment, and more people gathered, holding up their phones to capture the scene. A wave of solidarity swept through the crowd. The policeman, feeling his control slipping away, tried to lash out again, this time aiming for James. But this time, James didn't flinch. His friends moved quickly, forming a protective circle around him. Their unity became a symbol of their collective strength. "We are stronger together," one of James's friends shouted, and the sentiment rippled through the crowd. James felt the power of their unity, and it filled him with hope. This wasn't just about his personal revenge anymore. It was a fight for justice for everyone who had been wronged. As the crowd surged, the policeman, now visibly shaken, called for backup. But it was too late. The crowd demanded justice, and the officer's disregard for their rights was turning against him. James could feel that their actions would lead to real change. In the days that followed, the media coverage of the protest gained traction. City officials, feeling the public pressure, announced an investigation into the officer's conduct. It was the first sign that change was possible. James began meeting with activists and human rights defenders, forming alliances to push their cause forward. They organized more campaigns, raising awareness about police violence and advocating for community protection. Day by day, James saw the impact of their work. Local residents started taking to the streets in support, demanding justice. James became a symbol of hope, and his story inspired others to come forward with their own experiences of injustice. Though the journey toward justice was long, James no longer sought revenge in the form of violence. His goal had evolved into something far greater, ensuring that justice was served, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had ever faced brutality at the hands of those sworn to protect them. On that day in front of the police station, James and his friends accomplished what had once seemed impossible. Their voices, once small and afraid, had grown into a powerful force for change. Each word, each shout, sent waves through the crowd, reminding everyone that justice isn't just a concept, it's a right. As the protest ended and the crowd dispersed, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He looked at his friends and the people around him, and hope surged in his chest. They had done more than avenge his mother. They had fought for the rights of everyone. A few days later, as media coverage of their protest continued, city officials were forced to respond. The investigation into the officer who had assaulted his mother became a focal point for public outrage. James and his friends continued to work with activists, organizing new efforts to fight police violence and build a safer future for their community. With each step, they became stronger, and their message spread. What started as a fight for one person had grown into a movement, and James knew they weren't alone. Together, they were building a world where justice wasn't a privilege, but a promise. And though the memory of that awful day still lingered in James's heart, it had become a catalyst for change. His thirst for revenge had transformed into a drive for justice, and in that, he found true liberation. We hope you enjoyed this story, and that it touched your hearts. We would love to hear your opinion right in the comments. What you think about what is happening, and whether you have experienced racism in your life. Your stories are very important to us, and we appreciate each of you if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us grow and create even more content. Thank you for being with us. Have a nice day.